When we think about history, right, our minds usually go straight to the big stuff. The dates, the kings, the massive epic battles. But what about the everyday stuff? What did people actually eat for breakfast? What did they wear? How did they get around? The funny thing is, locals living in any given era almost never write about their mundane daily routines because, well, to them, it's just boring. It's just life. So to really get a feel for the texture of history, we've got to look through a totally different lens, the eyes of outsiders. We need foreign travelers who actually took the time to write down the stuff that the locals completely ignored.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to travel chronologically from the 11th straight through to the 17th centuries to explore three totally fascinating, vastly different men. First, we'll look at the outsider's perspective in general. Then we'll dive into Al-Biruni the scholar, Ibn Battuta the adventurer, and finally, Bernier the critic.
All right, let's jump straight into part one, the outsider's perspective, seeing the unseen.
Now, to really get why these historical accounts are basically pure gold, we kind of have to get into the psychology of a traveler. Just think about it for a second. What's the absolute weirdest or maybe just the most surprising local custom you've ever bumped into while traveling? Maybe it was some unique street food or how people greeted each other, or even just the physical landscape. You know that jolt of culture shock you felt? That is exactly what these historical travelers were feeling, but honestly on a massive, epic scale. To a foreigner, the everyday reality of a new place isn't just normal, it's absolute magic. And this is a perfect example of what I mean. To the local writers living in the Indian subcontinent back then, things like coconuts and pond leaves were just everywhere. They were so incredibly ordinary that nobody even bothered to mention them in their literature. But to these early travelers rolling in from the Middle East, Central Asia, or Europe, oh man, these things literally blew their minds. They would dedicate whole paragraphs just trying to describe a coconut. It's exactly this radical shift in perspective that turns these travel accounts into the ultimate historical treasure trove.
But let's be real. People in the 10th to 17th centuries weren't exactly hopping on a plane for a quick resort vacation. So why hit the road at all? Usually, travel was driven by some pretty harsh practical realities. People were seeking work, they were trying to outrun terrifying natural disasters, chasing trade and commerce, marching in brutal military campaigns, or going on religious pilgrimages. And yeah, sure, for a very select few, it was just about pure, unadulterated adventure.
Moving on to our second stop, Al-Biruni the scholar, geometry and translation.
So let's rewind the clock back to the 11th century to meet our first guy, Al-Biruni. Born in 973 in what is now Uzbekistan. Now, get this. What's totally wild is that he actually arrived in India as a hostage. Yeah, when Sultan Mahmud invaded his home, Al-Biruni was dragged off to the capital, Ghazni. But rather than just sitting around being a bitter captive, he developed this absolutely deep, obsessive fascination with India. He was, at his core, a pure academic. Just look at his own words. He wanted to create a clinical, objective database of knowledge, a help to those wanting to discuss religious questions, and a repertory of information. The guy literally spent years with Brahmana priests, mastering Sanskrit from scratch, just so he could read the original texts and understand the culture straight from the source.
This kind of scholarly, deep dive discussion was exactly what Al-Biruni lived for, and you can really see his mathematical brain at work in his writing. He wrote this absolute beast of a book, the Kitab-ul-Hind, which is 80 chapters long. And because he thought like a mathematician, the whole thing has this almost geometric, predictable structure. He'd start a chapter by posing a very specific question, then he'd follow that up with a highly detailed description based on Sanskritic traditions, and finally he'd wrap it up with a cross-cultural comparison. It was just so incredibly precise.
So why does a highly academic scholar like Al-Biruni matter so much to us today? Well, it all comes down to his linguistic analysis. Take the word Hindu, for example. Today, we automatically think of it as a religious identity, right? But Al-Biruni's context reminds us that the word actually comes from an old Persian term from around the 6th or 5th centuries BCE, and it simply referred to the geographical region east of the river Sindhu, or the Indus River. To the Arabs and Turks back then, Al-Hind, or Hindustan, literally just meant the physical place, and Hindavi was the language. It had zero religious connotation initially. It's this kind of crystal-clear academic observation that helps us untangle the actual evolution of history.
All right, let's switch gears completely for part 3, Ibn Battuta the adventurer, danger and discovery.
Jumping forward to the 14th century, if al-Biruni was our serious, dusty book academic, Ibn Battuta was the ultimate thrill seeker. He was born into a very respected family of Islamic judges in Morocco, but he was absolutely convinced that lived experience beat reading books any day of the week. Just listen to this quote. "Swayed by an overmastering impulse, I forsook my home as birds forsake their nests." He wrote that about packing up and leaving completely alone at just 22 years old. You can literally feel that infectious, restless wanderlust just jumping right off the page.
But hey, it wasn't all glamorous adventures and sightseeing. He left us this shockingly raw, deeply emotional account of his arrival in the city of Tunis. He'd been struck down by a horrible fever, and he felt so incredibly weak that he literally had to tie himself to his saddle just to stop himself from falling off his horse. And when he finally made it to the city, the townsfolk were cheerfully greeting everyone else, but not a single soul said hello to him. He was a total stranger. He actually wrote down that he felt so incredibly sad and overwhelmed by loneliness that he couldn't hold back his tears and just wept bitterly. It's moments like these that ground all these grand historical facts in very real, very relatable human emotion.
And that emotional strain, that was just piled on top of the massive physical toll of 14th century travel. 40 days? Think about that for a second. That is exactly how long it took Ibn Battuta just to make the trek from Multan to Delhi. And then it took another 50 days just to get from Sindh to Delhi. The sheer level of commitment required to see the world back then was absolutely mind-boggling. It pushed the limits of human endurance every single day.
And honestly, it wasn't just his endurance being tested. His actual survival was on the line constantly. The chaos out on the roads was intense. Highway robbers were a very real, deadly threat that travelers faced all the time. Now, Ibn Battuta wasn't foolish. He preferred traveling in massive caravans for the safety in numbers. But man, sometimes even that wasn't enough. On that exact 40-day route to Delhi we were just talking about, his caravan was ambushed. He had to watch fellow travelers be killed right in front of him, and Ibn Battuta himself was severely wounded in the fight. He was quite literally risking his life for the experiences and knowledge he recorded.
Now let's jump forward one last time for Section 4, Bernie, the Critic, the Western Lens.
Arriving in the 17th century, we meet François Bernier. He was a French doctor and a political philosopher who journeyed to the Mughal Empire hunting for new opportunities. But here's the catch. Unlike the highly objective al-Biruni or the super open-minded Ibn Battuta, Bernier arrived with a very specific critical agenda. He looked at absolutely everything through a comparative lens. It was always the East versus the West. And he consistently framed the situation in India as highly unfavorable compared to his home in Europe. But why? Well, he was dedicating his writings straight to his king, Louis XIV of France. He was basically trying to use his travels as a warning to the king about what he perceived as the fatal flaws in Eastern systems of governance and society.
And I have to mention, his lifestyle out on the open road, wildly different from Ibn Battuta's gritty fight for survival. Just check out Bernier's packing list. We are talking 2 fine Turkoman horses, a Persian camel, an entire entourage of servants, including his own private cook, plush carpets, a portable bed. Oh, and my favorite part? He specifically made sure to pack a stash of limes, sweet biscuits, and a special iron hook purely for draining curds so he could sip refreshing lemonade and eat fresh dahi on the road. Seriously, it was the 17th century equivalent of ultra-luxury glamping. And, as you can probably guess, traveling in that kind of luxurious bubble heavily colored his somewhat detached, aristocratic view of the everyday people he was writing about.
So, when we pull back and look at the big picture here, what do we really see? We've got 3 vastly different men. Al-Biruni handed us a scholar's mathematical precision and these incredible deep linguistic translations. Then, Ibn Battuta brought us the adventurer's raw emotion, the constant danger, and this unquenchable, restless curiosity. And finally, François Bernier gave us a critic's highly comparative, albeit super-privileged, Western lens. By layering these 3 completely distinct perspectives on top of one another, we don't just get a flat timeline of dates. We get the messy, multidimensional, deeply human history that we rely on right now to understand the incredibly vibrant past of the subcontinent.
Which brings us to one final, slightly mind-bending challenge for you today. Take a second and just look around you right now. Look at the room you're sitting in, the actual device you're watching this on, or even just the random food sitting in your fridge. If you were a traveler writing a historical account today, what completely ordinary things would you actually write down for the historians of the year 2500? Think about it. What modern-day coconut or palm leaf are we completely taking for granted right this very second?